Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to the COTA post-race reaction. What was your thoughts on this race? Did it give you enough action on track, or did you think it was kind of dull because Max didn't get really challenged at all in this race? Did the battle between Lando Norris and Charles Leclerc give you enough to put you over the edge, and you really enjoyed this race? Try to figure out where that was going to end up for the Drivers' Championship. Did the backfield help you out any, with Kimi getting spun early on and then trying to come back into the points, and with other drivers trying to work their way up, like Yuki, who started off poorly in qualifying and had to work their way through the field as well? How did that play into your liking of this race? And what about all of the track limits? There was a total of 6 black and white flags that were thrown to different drivers as they were, getting the warnings for meeting those track limits and trying to basically take advantage of going across those tracks, edges, and trying to figure out what that place was. Now, do you think that was too much, or do you think that was just perfect because the drivers know exactly what they can get away with, and so they were just pushing it to the limit, with 6 drivers going all the way to the end and getting that black and white warning flag? Anyway, what was your thoughts on this race? I would love to hear those in the comments, and I will get on with the drivers and start from the back of the pack and work my way to the front, just like normal, telling you what I think of how that driver did and anything that happened to them in the process. So we start off with Carlos Sainz, who started off in 9th and ended up in 20th with a DNF. He did pass Behrman for 8th on lap 2, and then he was trying to do basically the same maneuver on Kimi Antonelli on lap 6 in that turn 15. And he kind of dove to the inside, and Kimi kind of shut the door, going around that corner, taking the apex a little bit tighter than he was normally used to, and just kind of collided with Carlos Sainz, or Sainz collided with Kimi and spun Kimi around, and then Carlos ended up having some damage to his car, which he could not actually complete that rest of that lap, and so he had to pull off to the side of the track and caused a virtual safety car in that run. Then we get to Pierre Gasly, who started off in 14th and ended up in 19th. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 27, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs, and had a slow pit stop. I don't have anything really else on my notes for Pierre Gasly. I must have been not very happy with that car, because him starting up and then dropping back 5 places overall is not the greatest position. And I know he was having some nice team orders at the end, trying to keep him in the lead, which didn't really happen either. So I'm not sure exactly what happened to those Alpines. Gabriel Bortoleto started off in 16th and ended up in 18th. He had a 2-stop strategy, stopping on lap 14, switching from a set of softs to a set of mediums, and then stopped again on lap 36, switching from those mediums to another set of softs. He did have contact with Albon on lap 1, turn 12, which caused a little bit of headache. I think they pushed him back in the field a little bit, but then he was able to recover a little bit by passing Ocon for 15th on lap 2. He did get a black and white flag for track limits on lap 38, and he passed Gasly for 18th on lap 56. So he started to come back, but not quite to where he needed to be, and ended up a couple of places down. Franco Colapinto started off in 15th and ended up in 17th. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 32, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs. He did lose 2 spots at the very first lap. He did pass Ocon for 16th on lap 2 and passed Gasly for 17th on lap 55. And he also got a black and white flag with track limits on lap 56. So the very last lap, they kind of gave him that black and white flag. So he didn't really have to worry about that too much in his race overall, but he did get that black and white flag. This gets us to Isaac Hydrar, who started off in 20th and ended up in 16th. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 28, switching from a set of hards to a set of softs. He did gain 1 spot at the very first lap and got a black and white flag for track limits on lap 6. So fairly early, Isaac had that black and white flag, but was able to maintain track limits for the rest of the race. So he didn't actually get a penalty as far as I'm aware. And I know he was really struggling this weekend in that car, not liking it at all throughout the whole weekend. So hopefully he can get better in the next race in Mexico next weekend. Esteban Ocon started up in 17th and ended up in 15th. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 24, switching from a set of hards to a set of mediums. He did gain 2 spots at the very first lap, so had a pretty good start for him, but then was getting overtaken a little bit during that race on the hard set of tires, where everybody else was on a medium or a soft set, so it made it a little bit easier for them to get back around him. But a really good start for him to gain 2 spots, even with that set of hards. He did pass Stroll for 17th on lap 3. And just ahead of him is Alexander Albon, who started off in 18th and ended up in 14th. He did a 2-stop strategy, stopping on lap 7, switching from a set of hards to a set of mediums, and then on lap 36, switching from those mediums to a set of softs. He did lose 2 spots at the very first lap. He did have contact with Borletto on lap 1, turn 12, which kind of spun him around and pushed him back to the back of the field, which he then had to come back through a little bit, and passed Isaac Hajjar for 17th on lap 22, passed Franco Colapinto for 15th on lap 26, did get a black and white flag for track limits on lap 38, but then went ahead and passed Isaac Hajjar for 16th on lap 38, and passed Gasly for 15th on lap 40. So he was kind of working his way back up, but unfortunately he didn't quite get back to the points where he was really aiming for, and so a decent run, but not really where he needed to be. I think he was complaining about those hard set of tires that he was on. It's like I didn't understand how bad they were to start off with, especially earlier in the weekend. That didn't seem that bad. So hopefully they can figure that out for the Mexico and get a little bit more grip and get those Williams up there. Kimi Antonelli started off in 7th and ended up in 13th. He did a one-stop strategy with stopping on lap 31, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs. Sainz hit him on lap 6 in turn 15, and it spun Kimi around in the back, and he had to wait for a lot of the drivers to go by before he could get back on track, which pushed him back where he had to get back through the field. So he ended up passing Isaac Hajjar for 16th on lap 17, passed Ocon for 15th on lap 20, passed Franco for 14th on lap 23, passed Gasly for 14th on lap 37, had a black and white flag where track limits on lap 40, passed Ocon for 14th on lap 48, and he did get the fastest lap on lap 33. So he was pushing it and kind of got the fastest lap during that stint, but couldn't quite make it back to where he needed to be. I know he was kind of frustrated with that, but I think that was a decent run after getting spun around in that car from Carlos Sainz. So I think he did a pretty good job of trying to recover from that and doing as well as he could in that Mercedes in that realm where he got pushed back to the back of the field and then had to work his way back through that backfield, which is a little harder apparently on this track with the wind direction change that happened. So you had that tailwind on the long straightaway, which made it a little bit harder for the people to take advantage of. Lance Stroll started off in 19th and ended up in 12th, so he had a pretty good run. He did one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 28, switching from a set of softs to a set of mediums, and he did gain 1 spot on the very first lap. He did pass Ocon for 17th on lap 3, passed Franco for 14th on lap 12, passed Gasly for 12th on lap 20, and passed Borletto for 13th on lap 34. So he was kind of making some moves, and I know he's going back and forth and battling a few cars throughout this race as well. So he had a lot of good action on track. I know doing fairly decent. He just needs to get his qualifying together so he starts up a little bit closer to his teammate and where he can get better and more likely into the points. Unfortunately, he didn't get into the points, so they didn't really help him that much, even though he had a pretty good run coming from pretty much from the back of the field to that mid-pack. Liam Lawson started off in 12th and ended up in 11th. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping at lap 30, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs. He did lose 1 spot at the very first lap, so not the greatest start for him, losing that position. He did pass Borletto for 12th on lap 34. So he kind of stayed out of the mix for most of it. Didn't really get a chance to really show off how that, Racing Bull was going to handle things, and so that things really didn't kind of go Liam Lawson's way. He was ahead of his teammate, so that's good, but not the best thing overall. So how that played out, I don't know how that's going to play out for him in these Racing Bulls. I know he's trying to figure out where his job lands, so hopefully can figure that out and get a job for 2026 as a driver and keep that field going. So hopefully that will come back around for him in the Mexico GP. This gets us to our top 10, where we find Fernando Alonso started off in 10th and ended up in 10th. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 30, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs. He did lose 2 spots at the very first lap, so not a very good start for Fernando Alonso. And usually we can see him doing a little bit better than that in his start, so this is not a great run for him. He did pass Borletto for 11th on lap 33. So I was thinking that he'd see a little better run from Fernando Alonso, especially him getting a better qualifying in that sprint qualifying session before he got knocked out. And so I was thinking that he was able to get back up there and get some little moves on some other people, but he did get a point, so that's always good to see. Oliver Behrman started off in 8th and ended up in 9th. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 30, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs. He had a 2.7 second pit stop, and he tried to pass Yuki on lap 35 on turn 15, and then went off the track and then spun around and kind of lost his momentum, where then he ended up getting passed by Hülkenberg a little bit later. So not that great of a run for Oliver Behrman. Now, it was good for him to get back up there in 8th position for the qualifying and kind of get up there, and he was pushing for that 7th position and just pushed a little bit too much, really pushing forward on that. I don't think that really would have worked out for him, especially having to go off the track even to start off with. So I think that was kind of bad on Oliver Behrman. I really like Oliver Behrman, but he did get a point or a couple points getting into that 9th position, but he was really pushing for that 7th position, which he really didn't have an option. And I know he talked about, if he didn't do it then, he would have never have gotten the chance. And so that's why he went for it. But I don't think he really had the spot on the track to do that. And he was trying to go off, just make that spot for himself, which didn't really play out. Nico Hülkenberg started off in 11th and ended up in 8th. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 33, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs, and he had a 2.4 second pit stop, so a pretty good pit stop for him. And he passed Behrman for 8th on lap 35 due to that issue that Behrman had. Now, this is really good for Nico Hülkenberg, who's getting back up into the points, which is always good to see with that Stake F1 Sauber car. And I don't think they were putting anything in there, so I really wasn't expecting them to do anywhere in this last few races on that car, thinking that they're all putting all their effort into that, Audi transition. So we'll have to see how they play out in like 5 races, as they seem to be doing a little bit better than I was expecting them to do in these last few races in the season. So hopefully they can keep that up in Mexico and the following races. Yuki Tsunoda started off in 13th and ended up in 7th. They had one top strategy, stopping on lap 29, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs. Had a 2.6 second pit stop, so a really good pit stop for him. And they had a 3 spots gain on the very first lap, so a really good start for Yuki as well. Kind of getting in the back foot to where he qualified from, not quite where he needed to be in that qualifying session, but still trying to make up some ground in that race, which is good to see. Hopefully he can, keep that up in the next few races as well to really show that he deserves that second seat in that Red Bull. He did pass Behrman for 10th on lap 3 along with all of that. So it's really good to see. I said, Yuki, getting some ground, getting some traction, and hopefully that's turn around for him as that transition happens, so he can get a little bit better feel for that second seat of that Red Bull. George Russell started off in 4th and ended up in 6th. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 33, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs. He did a 2.3 second pit stop, so that was a really good pit stop for him, and lost 2 spots in the very first lap, so that was not a very good start for George Russell. And then he kind of got stuck there. He couldn't really make ground on the Ferraris or Oscar Piastri after all of that, and really was kind of stuck in that position. Kind of did pretty decent to keep ahead of Yuki, but not really where he needed to be, kind of standing alone in that process. This gets us to Oscar Piastri, who was in that top 5 position. He started off in 6th and ended up in 5th. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 30, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs, and had a 2.3 second pit stop, so a really good pit stop for him and that McLaren, and he gained 1 spot at the very first lap, so it got him into that 5th position where he was ahead of George Russell and maintained that pretty well without getting too much risk from behind, but really couldn't make any ground on those Ferraris ahead of him. I know he was struggling a lot in that car after the incidents earlier in the weekend with the sprint qualifying, the sprint race where they got knocked out and had to rebuild those cars in that setting, and they came back on the qualifying session and really didn't feel it there, and it really didn't feel it in the race either. You could really tell from his radio communications that he was kind of down and out, trying to figure out what the best thing to do was, and ended up in that 5th position overall, losing some good driver standing points to Max and his teammate Lando. So that'll have to come back, and hopefully he can bounce back in Mexico to really put some more pressure on those two for the Drivers' Championship. Lewis Hamilton started off in 5th and ended up in 4th. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 31, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs, and added 2.6 second pit stop, so a decent pit stop for him. He gained a 1 spot on the very first lap, so a good start for him, gaining that spot, and had a black and white flag for track limits on lap 56 for the very last lap. So he kind of pushed it to the very end before getting that warning, but didn't get that warning. I figured I'd throw that in here as well. So I know he wasn't quite where he wanted to be, especially with his teammate just ahead of him, and really couldn't put pressure after that pit stop strategy, where he was kind of pushing right before the pit stop. But after that pit stop, he really didn't gain any ground on his teammate. And so that kind of hurt him a little bit. I think he was a little bit frustrated with that, but I think he will get a little bit better. I think things are starting to click with him in that Ferrari. So hopefully we'll see that in the Mexico GP race next weekend. Charles Leclerc started off in 3rd and ended up in 3rd. Had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 22, switching from a set of softs to a set of mediums, and had a 2.3 second pit stop. So a really good pit stop for the Ferrari and Charles Leclerc. And he's the one that started off in softs. So I think the only one started off in softs. And so that kind of, up in the front, I should say. And so that pushed him in the edge and was able to take advantage of that, getting past Lando on that first lap. That helped him maintain that, and then kind of played defensive position. And that kind of gave that gap for Max that really didn't feel like that he was getting challenged for anything during this race. So that kind of made that really front runner position boring, but it was kind of interesting to see Lando go back and forth on Charles. He went to the outside of Lando on that, turn 1, lap 1, and made it around him just enough to where he could get to that second position. He did pass Hulkenberg for 8th on lap 26, and passed Behrman for 7th on lap 28, passed Yuki for 6th on lap 29, and was voted the driver of the day. Now, I can definitely see this as he was, coming back and wasn't quite the star driver in the sense of thinking that everything was going to work out and be in that second position and maybe push some pressure on the first. So he was kind of the outside person, getting up there in that second position, holding it for a good long period against Lando, in that regard, and then making that battle quite interesting for that second position overall. But what was your thoughts? Did you think he deserved driver of the day? Would you give it to somebody else? Would you give it to like Yuki, who was trying to come back through the field, or would you give it to someone else? And this gets us to Lando Norris, who started off in 2nd, ended up in 2nd. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 32, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs, and had a 3.8 second pit stop, so another bad pit stop for McLaren. It seems like that second pit stop is really messing things up for McLaren, so they need to get their act together and try to figure out what was going on exactly with those second pit stops and get those synced up. It seems like they have some issues with some, the air guns, with getting those nuts off the tires or getting them back on one of those tires. And so there's always something going on in that pit stops for the McLaren on that second pit stop generally. And so if whoever hits that second pit stop usually gets a worse pit stop than the first one. So I'll have to figure out how that plays out. He did lose that one spot at the very first lap to Charles Leclerc because he didn't quite take the right movement on that turn 1, lap 1, around the corner edge, but was eventually able to take that second spot. He did get a black and white flag early on lap 21 for track limits, so then he had to play it really cool and not do any track limits from that point on, and that was including trying to get past Charles Leclerc, so that kind of made it, I think, a little bit more interesting on his battles with him. Now, I think Lando should have been able to pass Charles Leclerc the first time a little bit faster, and probably the second time as well. I think he could have lined things up. And of course, this is me looking, at 2020 vision after the fact. But during the race, I know that's really hard to do, but I think he should have been able to tweak it a little bit and then put a little bit more pressure on Charles and maybe have gotten a little bit better action to push on Max. I'm not sure if it would have changed the results, but it would have been a little bit more interesting, I think, in that regard for Lando to try to do that. But it ended up turning out a decent race for him. So he passed Charles Leclerc for second on lap 21, and then he had to go pass him again for second on lap 51 after making his pit stop. This gets us to Max Verstappen, who started off in first and ended up in first. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 33, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs, and had a 2.6 second pit stop, so a decent pit stop for him as well. He had a good start, kept him in the lead, and kind of basically stayed in the lead for most of it without any issues. I know they came on the radio and kind of warning him about those soft tires, and then he came back and said he was starting to slide around, all of a sudden. So there was some give and take that there wasn't perfect on that Red Bull, but he was able to maintain that due to that, Charles Leclerc getting between him and Lando. I think in general that Ferrari really wasn't able to keep up with the Red Bull, where the McLaren potentially could have in that regard. So we kind of missed a battle for the front, but got a battle for that second position instead. So I don't know if that was truly the case, or if it would have just been around following the leader for this race if Lando got into that second position to start off with. But really good run for Max Verstappen, qualifying, in pole position, staying out there for the race and be able to take it home. Really well done for him. So to kind of break down this race as we go through this aspect, we have, on lap 5, we have a 3.02 second lead for Max over Charles Leclerc. Then we had that virtual safety car come out from lap 7 through about lap 9. So by lap 10, it was a 3.01 second lead for Max over Charles Leclerc. And by lap 15, it had grown to a 6.3 second lead for Max over Charles Leclerc. By lap 25, it was a 11.18 second lead for Max over Lando, because Charles Leclerc had pitted at that point. And at halfway, it shrank a little bit down to a 10.45 second lead for Max over Lando. By lap 35, it was switched back because Lando had to pit, and Max had a nice gap to pit in. So it was a 6.25 second lead for Max over Charles Leclerc. Lap 45, it was up to a 6.75 second lead for Max over Charles Leclerc. At lap 50, it was a 7.41 second lead for Max over Charles Leclerc. And by the end of the race, lap 56, it was a 7.95 second lead for Max over Lando. So here we see some graphs, and this one's basically showing, the deltas for those laps right before Charles Leclerc decided to pit. As you can kind of see here, he was kind of struggling just into that run, and so this is where Lando had passed him, for that second position, but right before Charles Leclerc decided to pit, and he was having some, battles on track with his teammate Lewis Hamilton as well. But this is kind of showing those top roughly 10, drivers, and you kind of look at that and kind of figure out what those deltas are, but in the gaps between those on this around that lap 23 marker. And then we come to the next one, which I have here, which is basically right after all of those top 3 drivers had pitted. And so we basically have, Max in that blue, Lando in the orange, and then Charles in that solid, red or maroon color in that regard. And so you get those averages there and kind of figure out how things played out, where, Lando had to come back out of the pits behind Charles Leclerc and then kind of make that gap, shrink and then get him past him again at a later date. But you can kind of get those ideas of how well those drivers were running, in that run. And this is about, lap 34, just after lap 34-ish run. And finally, I have one at the end just to kind of show you those top 3 drivers and where they kind of ended up relationship to each other. And here you can kind of see at the beginning of that graph where Lando ended up eventually passing Charles Leclerc again for that second time to maintain and get that second position for the end of the race. And so that kind of gives you that idea there on how things were playing out. So what did this do to our driver standings? Of course, Oscar's still in the lead with 346 points, but Lando's closed that gap up a little bit, now with 332 points. But Max has gained some really good ground here with 306 points now. George Russell's not horribly behind, but doesn't really have a shot at that first position with 252 points. We really see Nico Hülkenberg jumping up to that 9th position now with 41 points, jumping over Isaac Hydjar and Carlos Sainz. And we see Oliver Behrman jumping over Gabriel Bortoleto to that 18th position now with 20 points. And for the constructor standings, of course, we already have the constructors with McLaren who won it in Singapore. And we have them, increasing that lead a little bit with 678 points over Mercedes, 341 points. But we have a nice close range for that second position because we have Ferrari with 334 points and Red Bull now with 331 points. So there's a big battle for that second position for the constructor standings as well. So we'll have to figure out who's going to play out in the next 5 races in that regard. Now, Williams has 111 points. And, as we go back into that field, we kind of see that Haas gained a few points here as well with 48, but still maintaining that 9th position. So what do we have coming up next week? We have the Mexico or Hermanos Rodriguez GP race on October 26th, so next weekend. It has a length of 2.674 miles with 71 laps being run for a total race distance of 189.881 miles. The lap record holder currently is Valtteri Bottas in 2021 with 1 minute 17.774 seconds. It was first introduced in 1963, and so we will have a good race then. And until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.